Hey KBC, welcome to week 2 of my thoughts on the story as we go through. We are now in our second chapter of the story, and we're talking about, of course, the story of Abraham, and also we're going a little bit into the story of Jacob as we prepare for this coming Sunday when we're going to be starting chapter 3, looking at the story of Joseph. So right now in chapter 2, again, a lot like chapter 1, there's a lot in here that I really had to pick and choose to see what I want to really talk about. And really, I'd say that there's one large part of this chapter that I want to talk about. But before then, there are a few smaller honorable mentions that I want to bring up as well. The first thing that I really want to talk about is how in this chapter I really noticed how God calls the faithful, and he doesn't call people who are necessarily qualified for the position that they're being called to. Throughout Scripture you can see all of these different characters that God calls to greater and greater things, and these are oftentimes events or callings that the individual would never be able to fulfill on their own strength. Really, I'm reminded of Paul's letter where he writes that, in his weakness, God is made strong. And it's really through these moments where only God could bring about success and victory. Those are often the moments where God moves in the largest of ways. So throughout Scripture you can see all of these different moments where God really does call people who need Him in order to finish their calling. Of course, just on a more practical side of things, we can look at that in today's day too, right? Do you really think that God can't do that today? Do you think that He isn't going to call you to things that don't make sense, to call you to things where you can't possibly do it? Well, in my opinion, that just gives God so much more room to grow. So there's a thought there. Also this idea that, Abraham, he listened to God and he obeyed God's calling, even though, you can see on page 14 it says, even though he did not know where he was going. Abram didn't have the whole side of the story. He didn't know everything that was going to happen. He didn't know how everything was going to work out, but he still trusted God, even in those moments of uncertainty. So, again, God calls the faithful, but He doesn't always call the qualified. Something I've said a couple times already is God qualifies the called. He doesn't call the qualified. So that's the first big thing I really want to mention here. The second thing, though, is, this chapter, not only does it talk about how God calls the faithful, but it also shows that God Himself is faithful. This chapter, I found, was really all about God's faithfulness, and He's beginning this process to redeem humanity here and now in chapter 2 through Abram. So, as I said last week, God promised that the sin that has entered the world, that it would be temporary, and one day it would be conquered. You can see this promise in Genesis chapter 3 when He curses the serpent. And now, in chapter 2 of the story, we can see that God's chosen people have been established, and through Abraham's family, the entire world will be blessed. And of course, this promise that God made to Abraham is fulfilled in its ultimate sense through Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who is from the line of David, the tribe of Judah, from the son of Jacob, who is descendant of Abraham. So those are the two honorable mentions I want to bring up, but the third and the big picture that I want to talk about really is the almost sacrifice of Isaac. And this is a moment that is huge in this just biblical narrative as a whole, but I think as I've been reading through this story, there's there's more to it than just this almost sacrifice. And while Abraham needed to have so much faith in God to trust that God would be faithful and keep his promise, there's more background information that I think is overlooked, and personally, I'm fine admitting that I didn't think of this at all until I heard someone else explain this to me. So we'll try to do this a little bit of justice, and this is where I really want to focus on this episode here. So, first things first, God makes a promise to Abram, and he says that Abram will become a great nation. And of course, as we already know, Abram and Sarai, they're too old to have children. So, we talked about this a little bit on Sunday in this covenant that God makes, but first thing, when God first makes this promise to Abram, he's relatively vague. He doesn't really go too in detail on how this is going to happen, and you'll see as the story continues that he really expands upon what he means, and he really goes into detail on how this promise is going to be fulfilled. But at first, Abram, he seems kind of open to the idea that he's able to pass this blessing on to any male so long as they're in the household of Abram. So, taking into consideration Lot. Lot was Abram's nephew, but he was raised like a son, really. And I'm sure in a lot of ways Abram saw Lot as his son. But of course, this doesn't work out, and Lot and Abram end up going separate ways. And while God promises that Lot will also be a nation, it's not the nation that God promised to Abram. This will be a different people. So this idea with Lot being the successor of Abram's blessing goes out the window, and Abram changes his mind, and he starts to think that maybe God's blessing is going to be passed on to one of his servants. Because again, he still doesn't have his own son. But God clarifies his promise, and he says, no, Abram, that's not how things are going to work. It's going to be your biological son. So, Lot is now out of the equation. Abram's servant is now out of this equation. He knows that he's going to have a son himself. But, again, Sarai is too old, so she convinces Abram to sleep with a servant girl, Hagar, in order to be a surrogate mother for Abram to have his own biological son, and Hagar would kind of take the place of Sarai in terms of being the mother for the sake of Abram. A little bit of a weird process, but this was a fairly common thing in the ancient world. Because at this point, God has said, you will have a biological son, Abram, but he didn't clarify that Sarai would be the mother. So, Hagar is a surrogate mother, and they have Ishmael, a son. But then God specifies to Abram, again saying, no, you will have a biological son, but so will Sarai. It will be the son of Sarai who will be this blessing, this promised child. Yet again, God doesn't abandon Ishmael and Hagar, and while you can see that they get sent out, God promises that he'll take care of them, and that he will also be blessed and be a nation, but not the nation that will later be known as Israel, not God's chosen people. So finally, we're at the point where God has clarified his promise to Abram, and you can see that God says, you will become a great nation, it will be your biological son, it will be through Sarai, your wife, whom will be named Sarah, and this will take place a year from now. You will have a son named Isaac. He's very clear that Isaac is the one who is promised to be the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. So now we're at the point in the story where all of Abram's possible backup plans, all of the things that could have happened in terms of passing on this blessing in the ancient world are now gone. people who were raised like a son, people who were a part of his family but not biologically, people who were conceived and born through surrogate mothers. All of these backup plans are now removed from the equation, and God has very clearly specified that it would be Isaac, not even another son of Sarah. It has to be Isaac. And now God's telling Abraham to go onto the mountain and sacrifice Isaac. Abraham has no other options, and he's faced with this powerful test. And he has to show his faith. Will he be trusting that God is going to remain faithful and keep his promise? Or is God going to break his promise and remove yet another son-like figure from Abraham's life? Of course, we see at the end of the story of Abraham's story that Isaac is saved, and God stops Abraham at the last moment, pleased with the faithfulness that Abraham demonstrated. But it's so much more than a one isolated incident. This moment had a lot of preamble, a lot of things that led up to this one moment, and Abraham, he was really at the end of his rope. He had no other options, so he had to choose. Is God going to remain faithful, or am I losing another son? Of course, the other individuals weren't dead. They weren't sacrificed, but he knew that they weren't going to play this role that was promised, to continue and become a great nation, God's chosen people. So, as we go on through this story, of course, we talk about Jacob afterward, but really I wanted to focus especially on this moment right here with the sacrifice of Isaac, the almost sacrifice. So, I hope that you give this a little bit of thought. This is something that you can dig a lot into this idea of the other ways that this promise to Abraham could have been fulfilled, but by the end of the story, it's still a huge test of faith that, if I'm being honest, it kind of sounds hard for me to understand why God would have done this in the first place. I mean, human sacrifice isn't exactly common in the Israelite history. Certainly not when God tells them to. But that's just a few thoughts. There's a lot you can unpack, and I hope that you're able to reflect on this, think a little bit about how this might affect you as you read through this story again later, or maybe you'll read through chapter 2 again and talk about it in small groups if you still have some going on. But until next week when we talk about Joseph, you already know this is one of my favorite stories coming up in chapter 3, so I am looking forward to it, and I hope that you'll stay tuned and you'll hear what some of my thoughts would be for chapter 3. Until then, bye-bye.